All right, supposedly we are live. The question is, are we audible? Somebody tell me if you can hear me. Otherwise, I will keep looking at my things. It looks like it's picking it up. Yeah? I think it is. I'm just going to go because I think you guys will tell me. Y'all are going to tell me if you can't hear me. All right. Hello. It's been way too long. Sorry, guys. We've got like 5 inches of snow on the ground for Memorial Day. Got a fire going. Got the baby asleep. Got coffee. Coffee has milk in it. Very exciting for me. For those keeping track at home, with my baby allergy saga, it's over. I can eat whatever I want, except insofar as, you can't really eat whatever you want. Or at least there are consequences to doing that, which isn't entirely irrelevant to the topic I wanted to talk about today. So one of the things I've been thinking about that it's kind of been on my mind for a really long time, because it's just sort of interesting when you see these things kind of play out. People try to figure out how to sort of measure the impact of different belief systems. So, which I would just call philosophy, right? So this would include whatever different religions, political orientations would be political philosophies. And then there's more explicit philosophies like Aristotelian, Platonic, Kantian, whatever. And it's, it's interesting to look at what are the real world consequences for the people who follow these particular philosophies. What happens in their life? What does their life look like? And to ask yourself if you want your life to look like that. Now, this is not this isn't a real philosophical argument for any of these positions. It's entirely possible that the thing that's true, the philosophy that's true and correct, would not, at a particular point in time, lead to positive results in a person's life, right? It's possible, for instance, you could take an extreme example of, living in some sort of crazy totalitarian hell under the Chinese social credit system or something like this, with an entire regime that's based on lies, which seems to be most regimes in most points in history, and then knowing the truth and acting according to the truth could actually be terrible, could get you killed, right? And this is one theory that sort of evolutionary psychologists, evolutionary theorists sometimes put forward, that we're actually not wired toward the truth because a full adherence to the truth, capital T, as opposed to some sort of social truth or social norms, would actually get us killed at most point in history. So it doesn't necessarily answer the question of what is actually true, but it is interesting to look at. And I think it would be wrong to say that it's irrelevant, because if you're talking about a philosophy, and I take kind of the objectivist perspective generally on most things, right? The idea behind objectivism was supposed to be that it's a philosophy for living on Earth. And if that is how we are viewing the purpose of philosophy, right? The purpose of philosophy is to improve, figure out the correct way to live, and correct meaning, it leads to happiness or something like that, some sort of success. I do think it gets a little circular with the definition, so I'm not going to pretend that I have a perfect definition. But let's say we are generally agreed we want it to be life affirming, right? So at the very least, it should support survival to a degree. It should support happiness to a degree. It shouldn't lead to the extinction of the human race. It shouldn't lead to a decrease in virtues. It shouldn't lead to a decrease in values, human values in the world. Right. So, for instance, if the philosophy was everyone should just kill themselves, that would be wrong. Right? We'd all be pretty clearly on one extreme. That's wrong. Okay, so if we're trying to achieve a philosophy for living on Earth, then you would expect to see, when you look at the results of people applying that philosophy in their actual life, you would expect to see generally good things. You would expect to see that generally people who apply that philosophy are happier than people who don't. For one example, you might expect to see that there's some sense in which they're more successful than people who don't. So that could mean maybe they have more stability in their lives. Maybe they have some higher level of achievement compared to some sort of benchmark. Always hard to really measure these things. That's the kind of stuff that you would expect to see, right? So we can actually measure some of these things. And every few years a study comes out that does kind of look at some of this stuff, and it's well, I'll let you guys I'll kind of talk through some of it, and you guys can kind of tell me what you think the common denominator is. I think it's pretty interesting. So one of the things which just kind of got put forward again was looking at a bunch of different demographic ideological splits among people, and then how happy are they in their marriages specifically. So who's happiest? Anyone? It's been very consistent. All the studies I've ever seen have come up with the same answer, which is that the happiest people in their marriage are Christian women, and the more conservative Christian, the happier. And that is across a bunch of different metrics of happiness, including sexual satisfaction. They seem to have, at least they think they have the best sex life. And when it comes to something like your sex life, I think your own perception of it is probably all that matters, even if there were some objective outside way to measure that, right? So there, they seem to outperform other groups. Then you have other things you could look at, like divorce rates. Who has the lower divorce rates? Same group again. You could look at fertility. It's not universal. I know some people are like, oh, people having a bunch of kids, it's because they don't have access to birth control or whatever. But if we look in, places where that's not the case, if we kind of look in the West, we do see a strong relationship between fertility and happiness. And it kind of makes sense, because what is it that motivates people to have kids, right? I mean, especially if you're more case selected, you're probably having kids because, you think you can support that. You think it'll enhance your life. You think that you can enhance their life. You can kind of spread joy and happiness through having more kids. The people who are the most unhappy, generally in my experience, are the ones who are really not interested in having kids, right? The people who are like, the extreme that you hear is like, the world is such a bad place that it would be wrong for me to bring a kid into it, right? And that type of philosophical perspective, to me, is inherently a philosophy of death, right? Because even if you found the truth, and I'll be very blunt here, like, I hear this a lot from objectivists, and not just from people who casually identify as objectivists. I'm talking about people who seriously study the philosophy, who are leaders in the movement. Effectively, they have one kid, they have no kids. More and more, the new generation coming up is completely anti having kids, and that's literally a philosophy of death, right? It's supposed to be a philosophy for living on Earth. It's supposed to be a philosophy, of life, and it's literally going to die out. I mean, the idea is that you can kind of spread this philosophy just kind of dialectically and rhetorically. But if you think you can do a better job of explaining objectivism than Ayn Rand, well, good luck, I guess. I agree with Stefan Molyneux on this, that, if this is the correct philosophy, no one could explain it better than the person who invented it. She did an amazing job. Atlas Shrugged is a hugely popular book, even with people who don't agree with the philosophy. So if that didn't work, I don't know what you're going to do better, except to actually raise a generation of people with that philosophy. So which philosophy is going to be stronger, right? Here we talk about like, what's another heuristic where you might see a philosophy that gets you closer to, capital T truth? Is it the philosophy that, I don't want to say puts very little value on having children? There's a great deal of respect for the undertaking of having children and objectivism, but it's not put forward as a value. It's not put forward as a fundamental component of a full, well-rounded life. Which of course makes sense because Ayn Rand did not herself have children. So a philosophy that does put that forward is naturally going to propagate itself more, because parents, even if they don't set out to deliberately instill their philosophy in their kids, just naturally do it. We learn, most of what we learn is just imitating our parents. It's just modeling. It's, it's what we pick up. And it's vast majority from parents, even with public schooling. That modeling, that stuff that we've learned from parents, is this huge hurdle to overcome. That, even the massive amount of state education and propaganda that we have at this point is not generally enough to easily overcome that. So any philosophy that kind of pushes that to the side, or that discourages its members in some way from having kids, is simply not going to propagate. That doesn't make it false, but it kind of seems like it would be difficult for that to be true. Especially if we have this frame of this philosophy is supposed to lead us to the correct way to live as humans, right? The correct way that man is meant to live on Earth. You're not really going to get there if you don't have this self-propagating element, right? Which the most straightforward way to do that, like overwhelming, like this is just empirically obvious in my opinion, is, through just actual procreation, having children, not necessarily having like 10 children, because I do think there's a quality versus quantity, but one is not working, right? You need 2 people to make 1 kid. So every generation, you have half as many people of your philosophy if all you have is 1 kid. And if you have none, it's like you're done in a generation, right? So who's having the kids? Again, for the most part, it's certain religious groups. There are definitely ones that are more extreme than Christians, even the more conservative Christians, but they're way ahead of the other groups. And starting younger, so probably having higher quality offspring as well, more likely to homeschool, more likely to put their kids in private school, more likely to invest in their children, more likely to have a stay-at-home parent. So all of those are kind of good signs, right? And if you kind of look at the empirical outcomes that result from that, if your philosophy was true, you would expect the implementation of that philosophy to make you just sort of naturally stumble upon these better ways of doing things, right? Like things that later you can kind of verify more scientifically, like, oh, that's why that works, right? Okay, here's a good example that I just saw right before making this stream, so this was kind of cool. So there was a woman doctor giving some examples of, I don't know, it was supposed to be like sexism or whatever, just male doctors like sucking for some reason or other. And the example I saw was an anesthesiologist who works in a hospital for pregnancy and stuff like that, maternity hospital, who was saying that, God intended women to suffer during childbirth. They shouldn't get anesthesia during childbirth, and also that getting a C-section is like cheating and taking a shortcut. So of course she was tweeting this as though this was a totally horrible thing. It's like, oh my gosh, how can this guy be like giving, care to women when he believes women should suffer and all of that. And I don't believe this at all, right? I don't believe that we were designed, I don't believe the Garden of Eden story and that's why we suffer in childbirth. We do suffer in childbirth though, that's for sure. That definitely surprised me. I thought it would be a little exaggerated. It's not exaggerated at all. It sucks, it's horrible. But as we've learned more and more about how childbirth works, how doing different things medically, different medical interventions affect the mother, affect the baby, affect your future fertility, affect like all different kinds of things, right? Your body, your ability to rebound, like all these different things. What have we found? Well, we have found that yes, it is a very bad idea to interfere with the woman's physical sensations during labor. Epidurals are possibly safer than other forms of pain control. I mean, not like hypnotism, but it may not physically get to the baby. We're not actually sure. It's really hard to test them to figure out something like that. But despite that, there is a cooperative dance essentially that takes place between the woman and the baby as the baby is navigating its way out. And when the woman is cut off from those sensations, she can't work with the baby. She can't feel what's going on and give the baby the support that it needs through that process. And the birth process, as horrible as it is for the mother, it's like really awful for the baby, right? But it's awful in a way that, we're sort of designed for it. It's supposed to happen. I mean, there are all kinds of crazy outcomes when the birth process is interrupted, that we found. Just this is just empirically, right? For instance, kids who are born where labor starts and it's not able to complete and they're born via C-section, have a harder time later in life completing tasks, like completing things, right? There is something psychological that takes place for us in the birth process. Birth trauma is a well-documented phenomenon that can affect people through their entire life if it's not addressed when they're young. So yeah, actually, we are meant to feel that pain. That is part of the process. And yeah, if you cut that short with a C-section for convenience, yeah, you are doing something bad to yourself and bad to the baby. A C-section is major surgery. People are very flippant about it. You cut yourself open, you cut your uterus open, you may not be able to have more kids. There's a limit on the number of C-sections you can have. Your uterus could rupture. There's a 1% chance of your uterus just straight up rupturing the next time you go into labor. That's 1 in 100. In some ways that's a small number, but that's like if you're a hospital that does a lot of C-sections, you're going to see that pretty regularly. And when that happens, the baby usually dies and the mother sometimes dies. And if you weren't then you have to have your kid in a hospital on top of that, right? Having a baby in a hospital is awful. Like it's totally not the way to do things, right? Home birth all the way. That's off the table for you. Once you've had a C-section, you have to do it in a hospital because otherwise the baby will die if there's a rupture and you might bleed out before someone can get you to the hospital. So yeah, actually, like the reason that this guy gave, may not be correct. Maybe it's not because God intended women to suffer or whatever the Christian mythology is, but the end result, is it correct? Yeah, the end result is correct. We shouldn't be giving painkillers to women who are in labor, and we shouldn't be doing C-sections that are unnecessary, right? So that's sort of interesting. Whereas if you look at the philosophical background that I come from, the more objectivist approach, the typical attitude would be nature is something for us to overcome, right? Like there is this line, sort of nature to be commanded must be obeyed. So there's not some idea that you can just rewrite the world entirely, but the attitude would be these technological innovations, like taking the pain out of childbirth, are a good thing. It's a good thing. Go ahead and do it. The C-section, similar, like a good thing. If it's going to save you some trouble, if it's going to save you some possible damage from going through regular birth, it's just easier. Like let's just make things easier, basically. Let's make things easier for people, easier for the mother, easier for the baby. But then what actually happens? What actually happens is in the long run, that's harder. In the long run, that's worse. It has worse outcomes. And that's what I mean by these heuristics for philosophical truth. Like, that's not what we would expect to see if this philosophy was correct, right? So as absurd as this story sounds, snakes and apples and women being punished with childbirth pains, that's getting you to better decisions. That belief is leading to better decisions today, for the most part, than a belief that seems to be more based on kind of science and reason. Oh, we are no longer asleep. Give us a second here. All right. Okay. All right. I'm gonna see what's going on over there, huh? You know, what's going on? You gotta wave at people. I can't let you go on there. You can get off of social media. All right. You wanna come? All right. We're not the sleep stream anymore. We're the awake stream. But thanks for sticking with us. Okay. So there's just more and more examples like this. I mean, they're really piling up at this point. And, you know, I think it's important sort of not to look away from them and, you know, ask yourself, whatever your philosophy is, you know, why does it lead to the outcomes that it does? And is that a reason to reconsider whether or not it's actually leading you in the direction of truth? You know, a really big one these days is, well, it's basically sex, right? Like sexual promiscuity versus being more sexually conservative. And, you know, at first it was like, oh, like back in the day, sure, it was important to be more sexually conservative because we didn't have birth control. We didn't have good ways of dealing with the diseases. But now we have science, you know, now we have medical science. We have birth control and it's very reliable. And now it's all just the upside. Now we can embrace, you know, the physical pleasure, and thank goodness for science for making, you know, sex safe and making all this stuff accessible for us, that we can just have a good time now and not worry about it. Except, is that really how it's working out? You know, we're seeing that women who have high numbers of sexual partners, I think if you have more than two, your divorce rate skyrockets if you eventually get married. And whether or not you think divorce is bad for individuals, we know it's bad for children. And as you know, previously mentioned, if you're not having children, you're simply part of a culture of death, right? You and your genetics and your beliefs and everything about you is just, it's just one and done. You're not going to make progress in the world. And that philosophy is not going to endure in the world. So that more or less can't be correct, or it's very unlikely, in my opinion at least, that's philosophically correct. So we're seeing that psychological impact in the long run. And then there's more examples of that. There's a decreasing satisfaction with sex for women, the more partners that they have. As things go along, right? And you see it everywhere anecdotally, but you're starting to see it more and more supported by statistics and studies. So it's starting to look like, you know, again, is this, the explanation seems awfully, at the very least, overly simplistic, right? God said, don't have sex, basically. But if you follow that rule, do you come to a better outcome than the people who follow a less restricted view of sexuality? Kind of seems like at this point, at least for most people, you do. And, you know, like I said, it doesn't mean that this is necessarily the truth. Like, the truth could be difficult. The truth could be something that is out of reach for most people. But then there's a sense in which it's like, how useful then is that truth, right? Can you really implement that in the way that a lot of advocates of philosophies like objectivism are pushing, right? If it's supposed to be a philosophy for living on Earth, in other words, and most people can't understand it well enough to implement it correctly, then how is it a philosophy for living on Earth? How does it actually work for people? How does it actually help people? So there's another heuristic, right? If people adopt this philosophy, does it generally help them or hurt them in their life? And does that scale with intelligence? It's entirely possible that there's, you know, that philosophy should be different for people in different sort of walks of life or different levels of ability or something like that. It doesn't change what's true, what's, you know, especially what's capital T true. But it is possible that there's just, what's realistic. And that was something that Ayn Rand recognized, right? She recognized that if objectivism ever became the dominant philosophy, the vast majority of people would follow it the same way they follow religion today. They would just kind of be following it by rote. But you have her own life to look at, the life of the person who invented it. You have, followers, you have people that she declared as, her intellectual heirs, people who really got the philosophy. And you can look at their life and, kind of judge for yourself whether the implementation of this philosophy led in a generally better direction than others, than others that people can follow. And for me at this point, I mean, it's hard to look at, so many childless people or people with very small families, so many people who really, I don't know how do you want to put it, like who end up following the logic of the philosophy to positions, to practical positions, right? Like concrete positions, like, the sex out of wedlock is totally fine, or, different, attitudes about contraception or about pain in childbirth, like all those things, where you follow that logic. And then what we end up eventually finding out actually works for people in reality. It seems like it takes you to the wrong answer most of the time. So yeah, I don't know. What do you, have you guys noticed any other things like this? I just am amazed at how many just seem to be coming up where it's like, there's just a really nice story that makes a lot of, it seems to make a lot of sense. It's like, it looks good on paper. And it would be really nice if things worked this way. It would, that would be great. And then the other side, it just doesn't look so good, or it even looks ridiculous, right? It's like, talking snakes or telling people this, and like, it's just so arbitrary, and the rules just seem like overly strict, and like, surely as humans with all of our ingenuity and our ability to reshape the world in our image, we'd be able to overcome this stuff fairly easily. And then you just kind of look at the results, and that's just not how it seems to be working. It's pretty interesting. Interesting times. Baby. Hang on a second, we gotta get baby sleep. You going to sleep? Yeah, so overall, the importance of this stuff is something I've definitely gone back and forth on in my life. When I was younger, I was extremely resistant to learning anything about pretty much anyone that I admired. I always hated biographies. I was never one of those people who, got excited about some work and then wanted to learn everything about the person, basically because I just expected it to disappoint me. I expected, I guess like all heroes to have feet of clay and whatnot. And I definitely took that attitude when I got into objectivism. I mean, I was just like, here's all this stuff that Ayn Rand wrote. It's 100% correct. It resonates with me. It makes perfect sense. And I just don't want to know, like, I don't even want to look. I don't want to know anything about her life, because I'm sure it's going to disappoint me, but that is irrelevant to whether or not, what she said was true. And that's interesting because that is quite the opposite of the attitude that Christians take when it comes to Christ, right? Like, you are supposed to study Christ's life and learn, lessons from that and look to him as a model of behavior. And kind of separating those two things, like separating the person from the work, is like, it's not, I don't actually think that it's wrong. I think it's one valid way to look at things, but it's not it's not the, that doesn't make that pure, and it doesn't make looking at the person's actual life flawed. In retrospect, it's kind of insane to say, oh, here's this, idea, this abstract philosophy, and I'm going to dive headfirst into building my entire life around this, making this my moral code, letting this inform all of my decisions, without paying any heed to how that has worked out for other people, in particular, the person who invented it, right? And one would think had implemented it the most fully, the most accurately. And in my defense, I didn't really do that. I mean, I definitely did go, find as many objectivists as possible, and did kind of end up looking at their lives, and pretty quickly it was like, something doesn't seem quite right here. Right. And kind of bring in other judgments. But yeah, I mean, it's the opposite of what most people do, right? Most people see someone with the outcome that they want, and then kind of back into like, how is it that I get there? Like, do what they do, and so that I can have what they have. And that's also not always correct, because there is this element of luck, right? So you could duplicate every step that Trump ever took, and you wouldn't end up president of the United States, at the very least because context change, but also because luck is a major component. But yeah, I mean, it is a relevant question. Things like, what do I want my like end of life to look like? What do I want in sort of like the broad strokes of my existence, right? It's not this very specific, like, oh, I can't model my life after this person because they're a writer and I want to be a mathematician or something like that. It's more these kind of broad strokes items. It's like, okay, do you want to follow along the path of someone who had so much abundance of joy and happiness in their life that they have a big family that are happy and their kids are successful, or do you want to follow after someone who basically was like a spinster but sort of married, and it's kind of weird. That said, supposedly, I guess, I don't actually know what people generally think. I mean, at least what I was taught growing up was like, Jesus did not have children. I know the Da Vinci Code disagrees with me, but you do kind of have the same thing there. Of course, there is still this be fruitful and multiply command. So, presumably that's just special circumstances, being the Son of God and all. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of stuff I'm mulling over these days. I don't know why anyone listens to this stuff. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's time. Like, there isn't time for us to like just make all these observations and then figure out the right way. Because by the time you've done that, I mean, you might not be dead yet. You may be like halfway through your life. And that's a little late, especially if you're a woman. That's pretty late. That's way too late to be getting your shit together. But it's an ongoing process, right? It's an ongoing process, including the process of realizing that the universe does not care about you. We are back asleep. But I'm also out of things to talk about. Well, I'm not out of things. I have a totally different subject to talk about. I don't want to talk about it right now. I'm sorry. I need to do an actually pre-recorded video, I hear, because rumor has it YouTube doesn't like it when people only stream. So I need to actually record something and put it up. They don't have editing software anymore, so that'll have to be a one-take, unedited video sensation that I'm sure you all will love. But I can't remember. Oh, it's going to be a baby brain. Yeah, I'm gonna do a baby brain on breastfeeding because that shit is important. And there's so much nonsense out there about it. So much nonsense. It's kind of impressive. But yeah, that'd be another one. I mean, that absolutely fits in the same category, right? It's like what was the underlying sort of attitude, like this sort of pro science, pro technology. It's just so weird to say because it's like I live in a house, right? Like obviously I'm pro technology. I'm streaming right now. I'm pro technology. I don't quite know what the right frame on these things is. I don't know. I don't know how you would tell in advance sort of what technology is good and what technology is bad. There's something I don't think I ever talked about on here. Maybe I mentioned it as an aside at some point, but like just the technology of the written word itself had serious consequences for epistemology that were not all good. Um, so I'm quite confident, a dark side. There's probably a dark side to like having a house that I'm living in a cave that I'm not even aware of. I don't know, maybe it just makes you a little softer. But I'm not going to go live in a cave. And I'm not going to give up the written word, you know? But then there's other things you look at and you're just like, this is clearly too far, right? Like baby formula is a really good example of that. Baby formula was this, in retrospect, like insane hubris that we could design better food for a baby. And just to be like, baby formula isn't something that was invented recently, right? Baby formula was like, I think like a 19th century invention or something like that. And it was just, I mean, even the sanitation, like when they first made it, they just forgot an ingredient, like an essential vitamin, and a bunch of babies like died. I mean, it's so bad. Like, it's just so ridiculous. There wasn't like correct sanitation in facilities. They still make mistakes, right? There's still packaging mistakes happening with that stuff. And at the end of the day, it just like it straight up doesn't work as well as breast milk. Like not even close, right? I mean, to the point that the the formula manufacturers like even put on their label basically breast is best. You should start with that. Um, and it's just yeah, like, okay, so yeah, autistic rage is saying it starts with some sympathetic case like mothers having trouble producing milk. Well, you see this now with the abortion thing, right? And they're like, oh well, rape and incest, right? What, like less than 1% of abortions are because of rape and incest. But sure, yeah, of course, like we have to make it legal because of the absolute fringe cases, right? uh, everyone needs to be able to have an abortion because we have to protect the rape and incest cases that practically never happen. Um, yeah, so like with the formula thing, that was so interesting. I don't think it was a coincidence that it came about at the same time as mechanized labor, that it came about at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. And of course, like I am so pro Industrial Revolution. I am really glad that I'm not a peasant farmer. No matter how many times I read Anna Karenina, I still don't, I still don't end up feeling like Levin. I don't have an urge to pick up a scythe. I do kind of enjoy tilling, I must admit, but like end of the day, I'm definitely glad I'm not a peasant farmer, although I see some of the upsides. So I'm pro-industrial revolution, but it is true that one of the things that happened was now there was, women and men were on more equal footing in terms of their value as a laborer, right? When there's more mechanization, you don't need as much physical strength to do the work. And now that we're way past that and we're just in offices and stuff, there are some areas where women are more valuable than men in the working world. And so, of course, suddenly it was just like, well, we got to get, all these women working. We have businesses interested in that because, hey, if you double the workforce, you can pay them less. Increase the supply, reduces the price. You can, then you have the government saying, well, yeah, we can't tax moms like staying home, cleaning their house, taking care of their kids, educating their kids, but we sure that as heck can tax, their income if we get them into the working world. So then, oh, look, along comes formula, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you don't need to breastfeed your kid anymore. You can just, you can still have kids, of course, like go, make that future tax cattle, but then just go right back to work and feed your baby corn syrup. Like literally, it's corn syrup. in case you didn't know. It's literally corn syrup and like hydrogenated vegetable oil is what formula is. And then a bunch of vitamins that aren't nearly as bioavailable as they need to be to actually have a healthy kid. And yeah, and now it's gotten so ridiculous that it's like, if you, I'll talk about this in the other video, but like, if you let a kid breastfeed as much as they want to, like they do in the rest of the world, practically, they will breastfeed for like 4 to 6 years. And there seems to be good reason for that, which I'll go over in the other video. We dropped that down to 4 months initially. 4 months. They started pushing solid food for kids at 4 months a while ago. Now they've now admitted that that's terrible, that you shouldn't start it before 6 months. But prior to all this, prior to Industrial Revolution, we started at 1 year. And as someone who has a kid who's, just past the 1 year mark, I can tell you, like, there is a huge difference. She's had some solid food since 6 months, which is what they recommend now. Basically, if the kid is interested, they can try it. There's a huge difference in her ability to eat at 1 year compared to at 6 months. At 6 months, it's like baby food puree, like very careful. She chokes on everything. At 1 year, she basically just eats whatever's on my plate. So that completely makes sense that when people started, that makes a lot more sense to me. But then, of course, now we have this whole baby food industry and, all this stuff just basically pushing like propaganda just to be like, you need your freedom back or whatever, as though, it's such a burden to have a sweet little baby like literally sucking the fat off of you. That's the other thing. It's like, yeah, like all the baby weight and all, like, oh, having a kid ruined my body. It's like, well, not if you breastfeed them, because like you need way more calories to support a breastfeeding baby than you do to support a pregnancy. I don't think, and of course your body's ready for that stuff, right? Like, it's making you hungry. It's making you hold on to extra weight so that you have a store for breastfeeding. If you don't do it, you're messing up your own health, never mind the health of the kid. Yeah, 6 years is not ridiculous, I promise. I can explain all the details of it, like I said in another video, but it doesn't, the big thing is it doesn't really look the way people think that it looks. People think like, oh, if they're breastfeeding for 6 years, like that means that's where they're getting all their nutrition, and like you're breastfeeding them like 8 times a day and out in public and whatever. It's not like that. Like kids who are breastfeeding generally past a year and a half, 2 years, they're probably breastfeeding either like once a day, and it's like morning or night, like it's how they fall asleep or something like that. Sometimes it's just every other day, or like I talked to one mom who was like, it was like once a week, and tapered off for a while. So it's that kind of thing. Oh, you retracted your message, but you said something about kids getting teeth. Yeah, so I am sympathetic to the moms who get bit a lot, because I looked into it quite a bit. I don't have a biter, so I'm fine. But I was kind of nervous about that because I was like, well, I really want to make sure we get to at least 2 years breastfeeding, because that's, there are definite benefits, including boost IQ, to breastfeeding to 2 years. But it's actually more complicated than that, which I'll have to talk about another time. But it really does seem like there isn't a whole lot you can do about the biting. Anecdotally, there are different things that worked. Supposedly, like my mother-in-law claims that the first time she got bit, she just bit her baby back and then they never bit her again. I think that's awful. I would never do that. I think it's like barbaric and horrible. And I also have heard that does not universally work. And, my best friend's mom would flick her babies on the cheek with her finger, like the first time they got bit. And with my friend, her other babies, that worked. With my friend, after she flicked her on the cheek, she just refused to nurse ever again. So she was weaned like way earlier than her mother intended because of that. And it just depends. It's all of it. Like sometimes it makes no difference. Sometimes it's you can say ow and stuff. The one thing that's definitely not a good idea is like if you laugh and stuff like that, because you don't want the kid to think it's a game. But yeah, unfortunately, it does seem like sometimes you just have a biter and there's not much you can do about it. Of course, then you can switch to pumping to still try and get them breast milk, but you're never going to get to 2 years on the pump or something. Yeah, they will definitely remember. Yeah, if you're breastfeeding until age 6, I mean, you can just look. This is like a pretty easy empirical question, right? You can look at all the countries in the world where this is still normal. This is like just how it's done, and see whether or not, do they have higher rates of incest? Do they have like weirdness, or any kind of sexual dysfunction, or like things like that come from it? And I haven't seen any evidence of it. But there are lots of people who do it. You can look at the attachment parenting stuff. There's plenty of people who have been raised like this. So it's an empirical question at this point. To me, I totally understand the logic, like seeing how that might happen. But it's the same thing with homeschooling, right? It's like, oh, we can't homeschool because then how will they socialize? You can, like, homeschool kids don't know how to socialize with other kids their own age. And then, you kind of realize, like, well, is that the point? Or is the point to raise a functional adult? And maybe we should look at adults who are homeschooled as kids and how do they perform? And it turns out they perform fantastic. So anyway, we'll talk more about that on another video. But yeah, in the meantime, I wish everyone a happy Memorial Day, and I hope that I can get stuff out more. I feel newly committed to getting this stuff out, even though it's proven a little bit challenging with unreliable sleep schedules. Yes, I have a very wonderful baby. She's the best, but she there is nothing even remotely close to a schedule or a routine with this kid. She is all over the, just like every day. Every day it plays out a totally new, different way, which is fun. It keeps it interesting, but it does make it hard to schedule in adult things. So, all right. Well, I'm going to sign off. Thanks, guys, for joining. And in the future, so other than, my baby brain pre-recorded video on the benefits of breastfeeding that I hope you all check out, there will also be a video. This might be the next one. I hope it'll be the next one. And this one I'll do as a live stream, I think. But I want to talk about the question of whether or not girls should play sports. Should girls play sports? That'll be kind of an interesting one to look into. Because I played a lot of sports. I really liked it. But I have to say, I don't really think it's as clear-cut of a case as most people probably think it is. So, and there's some interesting news stories that haven't gotten a lot of coverage on this topic that I kind of want to draw some attention to. So we will talk about that next time. All right.